Live from Toronto, Canada, The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett from Zoomer Radio, AM 740.
And welcome to the Audio Imaginarium. Come on in, weary traveler, hang your cloak on a peg, grab a stool, and come gather around the fire. There are stories to be told, and you are among friends. Ed Komarek is standing by to talk about fire. Wildfires. What's causing them? Well, he says it is a rabid fire suppression culture to blame. Not climate change, not directed energy weapons, but a fire suppression culture. But he's also sounding the fire alarm that there is a very high probability of terrorist wildfire attacks in the United States and around the globe in the next few years. Pyro-terrorism. Ed is with us for the full 2 hours. We are streaming live on YouTube tonight, so get on up to the YouTube channel, The Conspiracy Show, and hit that red sub button if you haven't already. Now, let me introduce the boys in the band. Our fine rockabilly friend Ian Robertson is off tonight, gigging somewhere, I suppose. Stepping in for Ian on the Sunburst Gibson Les Paul guitar is Faz Kazi. Did I pronounce that correctly? Great. Our technical producer. Welcome, Faz. On the Rickenbacker bass guitar and occasionally the theremin, story producer, remote viewer, Albert Vinzel is with us. And finally, where were you last week, Albert? We got our signals crossed, I guess.
Yeah, I thought you were going to host from home that week.
I thought so too. Actually, I was spreading a rumor that you were spying or something. Something I do occasionally. Spread rumors and gossip. No, we're glad to have you back. You were missed, my friend. And finally, on the Hammond B3 live stream producer, Ryan White. Welcome all. Fire in Nature. A fire activist's guide is about changing a global culture of fire suppression to a culture of good fire management where prescribed fire is used to put simulated natural light fires back into fragmented light fire ecosystems. We'll find out what that all means in a moment. The book clearly points out that it is the unnatural buildup of fuel caused by over 100 years of fire suppression that is the real cause for widespread global destruction of forests and grasslands by catastrophic fire. Smokey the Bear and the United States Forest Service and other government agencies around the world have built these powder kegs, and now the terrorists want to light the fuse, releasing the power of multiple atom bombs on American and other cities. Why go to all the trouble and expense of making an atom bomb when several individuals in a plane or car can light a line of wildfires 100 miles long under high winds and drought conditions? Imagine a fire hundreds of feet high with the power of multiple atom bombs in a couple of hours could overwhelm all attempts at fire suppression. It could trap people in cities, killing thousands, maybe millions of people. Something equivalent to the devastation of cities by firebombing in World War II. Homeland Security is already informed as to the threat. We're about to speak about that in just a moment here with Ed Komarek. After quitting college at the University of Alaska and co-authoring the first scientific paper on the fishes of the North Slope of Alaska for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game in the early 70s, Ed went through an existential crisis and emerged intent on discovering himself and what life was really about. This led him into the paranormal field, eventually resulting in the writing of 2 books, now free, UFOs, Exopolitics, and the New World, Disorder and Enlightenment, The Long, Hard Road. Ed, however, has not forgotten his fire wisdom and knowledge gained early in life and in later years. Like his father, Ed Sr., Ed feels outrage over the needless man-caused catastrophic destruction of millions of acres of light ecosystems every year in the western United States, Australia, and elsewhere around the world. Ed Komarek, welcome to The Conspiracy Show. How are you?
Hey, Richard. Good to hear from you.
Fire in Nature, a fire activist's guide. We should point out that some of this is your writing and some of it is just sort of compiled from other people and so forth. Now,
yeah, what I try to do with my books is not just give my opinion, and basically if I say something, I want to back it up. And so fortunately with the internet, with word searches, you can get pretty good at that. And so I've tried to back up and footnote, everything that I say. And like, for instance, we were just talking about pyro-terrorism. If somebody does a search on pyro-terrorism, Homeland Security, the very top on the 3 search engines, at least on my search engines, at the very top is the latest is a 2005 paper that apparently is just put up there in the public domain, basically saying what I've been saying all along for years. So they're on to it.
Right. I want to address this narrative that's out there, though, that every year we hear they seem to be ratcheting up the hyperbole. The 2018 in places like British Columbia was, I read in some accounts, it was the worst year. Others, it was the second worst year for fires. They're talking now, we're seeing wildfires in places that we traditionally don't, in wetter, cooler climates, places like Finland, even what they call the peatland moors in England. Of course, we know where this narrative is going. They're trying to blame climate change for wildfire. What say you to that?
Basically, there is some, probably effect from climate change, but the real driver of these catastrophic wildfires is fire suppression. Way back in the 1920s and even earlier, even the formation of the Forest Service, they decided that fire was bad for the environment, and they've set out to suppress all fires. And starting here in the southeastern United States in the 1920s, they had the Dixie Crusaders that came by with projection screens and everything and trying to get the landowners to quit burning their woods. And what happened was that suddenly the quail started disappearing on the rich people's quail plantations here in my area, in my neck of the woods here down in southeastern United States. And they wanted to, so some of the people got together and they wanted to figure out why. And they brought Herb Stoddard down to study it, and the Cooperative Quail Association. And he did, and one of the chapters of his Black Quail book is on the importance of fire, and quail and a lot of other wildlife need annual fires here in the southeastern United States in order to survive. The suppression was against suppression was fought out by my father and his associates and Herb Stoddard. Herb Stoddard was a good friend of Otto Leopold, and my dad was mentored by Herb Stoddard, and he was mentored by Dr. Ali at the University of Chicago, one of the founders of the field of ecology. And my dad was really the first full-time fire ecologist. And they didn't have much luck out west. The Forest Service and other government agencies were very entrenched with the Smokey the Bear propaganda. And so what my dad had to do is starting in 1962, he really jump-started fire science by pulling together fire conferences from people all around the world. And even the Forest Service at that time wouldn't even allow their own people to come lecture on the importance of fire in nature, even on their own time and at their own expense. And fortunately, that's all changed, but you have this culture out west, a fire suppression culture that's so set that what's happening is as the firefighters get better at putting out fires, it creates more fuel accumulation in the forest. And that, in turn, forces the firefighters to get even better equipment, airplanes, dropping retardant and everything else, and keep those fires put out. And until you get in this vicious cycle of fire suppression and fuel accumulation, and that now is just unloading in these catastrophic mega fires.
So in other words, when you talk about this accumulation of fuel, you're talking about dead wood, older trees, that normally, forests would be sort of thinned out with a natural occurring wildfire, lightning would strike or something. It would burn out some of the dead wood. It would be a smaller fire. It could be controlled. But in the absence of these smaller contained wildfires, you have this latent energy that's building up in forests all over the world, really. And then when it does blow, it's these are huge wildfires, and that's why wildfires are getting worse, not because of climate change, but because of this fire suppression culture. It's worldwide, is it? This idea that we
Yeah. What I say is for instance, they used prescribed fire and control burning on the Apache reservation out west, and if it's climate change, how come the catastrophic wildfire hit as soon as it hits the Apache reservation fizzles out? And the reason is they're using frequent fires in the ponderosa pine there in the Apache reservation, and they're using frequent periodic fires, and what that does is it sweeps the forest clean. And what people need to understand is that fire has always been a part of nature. It goes back almost 500 million years to when the mosses first colonized the surface of the land and created enough oxygen for fires to burn, and it probably caused a die-off of 90% of the species at the time, because a lot of those species at the time couldn't handle oxygen. Oxygen was poisonous to them. And so fire has been a part of nature, and what happens is a lot of these, what I call light fire ecosystems, like ponderosa pine out west and longleaf pine here in the southeastern United States, what they do is they are adapted to burning out the competition. So they've got these very well insulated trunks and this kind of flaky bark. It's very good insulation to insulate the cambium layer around the tree. At the same time, they have these flammable needles that they drop to burn out the hardwoods and other competition. So what happens is the pines drive the ones that can't handle fire down into lowlands, into the wetlands, and they occupy what we call like down here in the southeast, a longleaf pine climax forest, fire climax forest. But if you get down the lowlands, you have what eventually happens is you have a beech magnolia climax forest, and those beech and magnolia can't take a lot of fire. They can take some, but they can't take a lot of fire.
Ed, I got to jump in here because the music is percolating up, which means we're going to go to a break. But my gosh, it's almost like there's a consciousness, an intelligence here with these trees.
Well, your house is a competition. When you put a pine tree or a eucalyptus tree not next to your house, it's going to burn your house up because it's trying to enlarge its the sunlight in space.
Okay, Ed, we'll come back and pick up on this. Ed Komarek is on the program, and we are talking about wildfires and pyro-terrorism. Back with more of The Conspiracy Show. Stay with us.
You're listening to The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett from Zoomer Radio.
Hi, it's your old buddy Richard Syrett, host and creator of The Conspiracy Show. I have news. We're now on Patreon. Now, I've put this off as long as I can, but now I need your help, and that's why we've joined Patreon. I have a small and very dedicated team of volunteers. Maybe you've heard of them. Albert Vinzel, my story producer, and Ryan White, my live stream producer. They come in every week without fail and work for nothing because they believe in the show, and I know you do too. So, I hope you'll consider becoming a donor. A small pledge of $10, $20, or maybe even $50 a month will help us out enormously. I would be eternally grateful. My pledge to you is that we'll continue to follow the truth wherever it leads. Please check out our page at patreon.com/The Conspiracy Show. Again, thank you. Welcome back. Ed Komarek is with us, and the author of a number of books, including Fire in Nature, A Fire Activist's Guide. And he blames what he calls a fire suppression culture across the globe now for the appearance or the sense that wildfire, well, they are getting worse. They're getting bigger. They're getting more destructive. But it's not because of climate change entirely. A large part of this, again, has to do with this fire suppression culture. Which means you have more sort of latent energy building up in forests around trees and wood that would normally be burned up in smaller controlled fires, but they're preventing that. Now, this whole Smokey the Bear fire suppression culture, what is behind that? I mean, are these individuals that started this, were they well-intended, or was there some nefarious plot? I mean, why did they institute this policy?
My dad used to say the road to hell is paved with the best of intentions. And you have to go back 10,000 years, really, to understand how this culture got started. Back when you had native peoples that were living off the land, what they did is they used fire to tend the landscape. And so all these landscapes that we've got here, these old-growth forests, or a lot of them, old-growth forests that we have, like longleaf pine in the east, and ponderosa pine and sequoia and redwoods in the west, the Indians tended these forests, and they opened them up, and they built these cathedral-like forests by using frequent light fires, because no self-suppressing Indian wants to hunt through briar patches and get all scraped up and get eaten up by ticks and red bugs and everything else. And so they opened up the land into these cathedral forests, and what they did was that by opening up the canopy and letting just enough sunlight to get down and grow the grasses and the legumes, that fed the wildlife, because most wildlife doesn't eat trees. They eat the grasses and legumes, and they don't eat brush. And so the trees need to be spaced a certain distance apart to be optimal for a good light fire ecosystem. So the native peoples all over the world built up what was ceded to us when they died from disease and conflict, and when the Europeans invaded in the United States and also elsewhere around the world. You lost your native fire managers who were using frequent fire as a livelihood. They would, burn like a briar patch. After 2 years, you burn it, and after 2 years, it fruits out, and you can eat blackberries for several years. But then you have to burn it again, or otherwise a brush will come up above it and shade out your briar patch. And so you have to burn a briar patch a certain way. You have to burn for blueberries a certain way. You have to burn for different kinds of wildlife, deer and quail and turkeys and whatever, a certain way. So they went through the woods burning with different kinds of fires, backfires that are really light, head fires where they wanted to really, clean out an area or whatever. So they were using a very advanced type of what we call permaculture today. They were economic, developed their substance from the land, and they had this deep intimate relationship with the land, because they were, part of nature, and they were dependent upon nature, and so they revered nature, and they had this close, intimate bond. But what happened 10,000 years ago, when native people the population started to build up from technologies of, bows and arrows and stuff, whatever, you had more people, you had to go to farming, which, people know farming is a lot more work. So you're not going to go to farming unless you've got a hot population that you've got to feed. And so they got into farming. As soon as the Europeans got into farming and using slash and burn agriculture, they started to lay waste to the forest. And as they moved into cities and villages, they mined the forest, which seemed unlimited to them, for trees, for building houses, whatever, and for firewood, for all these other different things. And so they devastated most of the forests of Europe during the last few thousand years. So that there's very few residual amounts of old-growth forests in Europe. So the cultural memory of the European colonizers is so far back of being part of nature, whereas a lot of the native peoples that were conquered have a cultural memory that were living close to nature, and living in nature is not that far away. So what happens is people have got divorced, Europeans have got divorced from nature, they separated from nature, they decided they were to conquer nature, and so what happens was this separation from nature ultimately results in what we have today, because what happens is they wiped out the forests in Europe, they came over here and they started logging, in Jamestown. They started logging trees for ships and for take back to Europe because they didn't have the trees in Europe anymore. And so they started logging, and in the early part of the 1800s, they just started widespread clear cutting down the whole eastern part of the United States, and then that all moved out west, later into the 1800s, during the Industrial Revolution. And people got even more divorced from the reality of nature and being part of nature and whatever in this process. And what happened was that this cutting of all these old growth forests that the native peoples had been tending and laying waste to all these forests, all this debris from the tree trunk is part of it, but what really burns is the pine tops and the leaves and all that kind of stuff. And so what happens is you started getting some catastrophic fires in these cutover areas, as well as there was no native peoples there to really manage it, to continue to burn it annually, like in the southeast, whereas nature would have burned it maybe every 4 or 5 years, in the southeast, but they were burning it much more frequently and whatever. And so the foresters that came over from Europe got caught up in these wildfires in the latter part of the 1800s and the early part of the century, and they had to fight these fires, and instead of really blaming themselves and blaming people for what had happened, they blamed nature and they blamed fire, and they started this fire suppression policy in the early part of the 1900s that's continued to this day, particularly out in the western United States, where it's been so ingrained, and it's quite different. They've had fires in Florida back in the 20s and 30s and 40s that were as bad as in California, but the culture between my father and his associates and some of the Forest Service people that actually rebelled and covertly started prescribed burning after some of these massive wildfires in Florida, the culture never got established. Fire suppression culture never got established, but out west it did, and so it's this constant thing. Now the Forest Service is paying over half of its budget on suppressing fires instead of wildfire mitigation and ecological reconstruction projects and whatever. So they're caught in this trap of more and more fuel, better and better firefighting with more and more fuel, and people like myself are trying to show that with the billion-acre plan for the western United States is the way out. How do you get out of this catch-22? How do you get out of this cultural trap that you got yourself into?
Right. Well, I have to say, that was a brilliant dissertation. You really condensed that down, and you did a great job with that. Now, a couple of things I want to pick up on. And one, you mentioned ticks. And this is a bit of a side road, but I think it's an important discussion. We have now Lyme disease. We have people worried about ticks. And they're saying it's now Lyme disease is near epidemic proportions, but the medical establishment doesn't really want to talk about it. Is that then tied into this whole fire suppression culture, the Lyme disease epidemic?
Yes, here in the southeastern United States where I live, I do some burning for clients as well as for myself, and I hardly ever see a tick because it makes sense. If you burn every year, the ticks they don't burrow underground and be protected like, some creatures do, mice and stuff like that. They get away from these fires. It's hard to really kill wildlife with a fire anyhow. But the ticks are all up on the surface and the leaf litter and all that. When you sweep the forest clean every year, you clean out all the ticks. But if you go down to Central Florida in places where there haven't been any fires and the ticks are very frequent, and you can't hardly get out in the woods without getting ticks on you, and a lot of them have got Lyme disease. And a friend of mine is actually crippled up. Actually, Herb Stoddard's grandson was doing controlled burning down in the central part of Florida, and a tick got him between his toes, and he got Lyme disease, and it paralyzed him where he can't even walk now.
Right.
And so the eastern, what happened with fire suppression in the eastern United States is it's not as dramatic, but it's been as devastating to nature as what's happening out west. It's just that you don't see it because what's happened is you wiped out a lot of the fire-adapted pines and species and herbs and grasses and all that kind of stuff in the eastern United States, and they were been replaced by hardwoods that don't carry fire very well. The strategy of hardwoods is to make leaves that are not very flammable, so they don't burn very well, so they don't get burnt out. And the strategy of the pines is to create hot fires to burn out the hardwoods. And so the hardwoods and the pines are all battling it out between each other to survive. And so when you clean out, when the forest is cleaned out with light fires like the native peoples, did, you don't have the problem with ticks and red bugs. It burns up the red bugs too.
Fascinating. Here's another thing I want to ask you about, and that is the loss of nutrients in our soil. Used to be, you'd have a fireplace and you'd take the wood ash out to your garden and you'd put that wood ash in the soil, and that was good. There was nutrients in there. And, about the time, I guess, electricity came around and people stopped doing that. So do you see a connection then between this fire suppression culture and the fact that we have no nutrients in our soil and therefore no nutrients in our fruits and vegetables?
That gets in the area of permaculture, and this, we have a lot to learn about sustained agriculture and permaculture, doing our agriculture in harmony with nature. But that's what the native people have been doing for tens of thousands of years, probably 60,000 years in Australia, and over 100,000 years in parts of Africa and in Europe. Even the Neanderthals were probably using fire to advance their own economic agendas and whatever for game and fruits and berries and nuts and all these kinds of things.
So now, and we're going to get into this discussion about pyro-terrorism, because now we have, again, this latent energy built up in forests throughout North America. And you describe it as it's an absolute powder keg. And you're saying that...
First we made the mistake that fire is bad for the forest, which has caused accumulations of fuel. And so instead of blaming the accumulations of fuel and the fire suppression activities of policies and whatever, we start blaming ignitions. We blame lightning. We blame arsonists. We blame accidental cat fires and whatever and whatnot. But that's not the real. There's always going to be people, and there's always going to be nature that's going to be they're going to be lighting fires. And so, if you build up a powder keg, there's going to be somebody that's going to light the fuse and blow you up. And so the ignitions is not the problem. Climate change is not the problem. Ignitions aren't not the problem. Fire is not the problem. Nature is not the problem. The problem is our own ignorance, our own separation from nature, so that we do stupid things. We build our houses out in the wildlife urban interface, and we put eucalyptus trees next to the house. And the eucalyptus is probably one of the hottest catastrophic fire types. And eucalyptus a lot of times just doesn't burn along the ground. Some of them do, but some of them just blow completely up in catastrophic fires in Australia and burn everything to the ground. And those eucalyptus can sprout out of the trunk after a fire like that. And so that eucalyptus or that pine that you've got right next to your house is dropping leaves and needles into your gutters on the top of your roof, your asphalt roof, and whatever, and wooden siding and whatever, is out to burn out the competition, and you're the competition because it's competing with other species and you for sunlight.
Now, is that why we see in these forest fires sometimes we see houses completely burned out, but then the trees around them untouched, and which has led to this whole conspiracy about directed energy weapons? And is that what's happening? Explain why we see houses.
This is where their ignorance comes in again, and it's our culture. It's our separation from nature. Native peoples understand what's happening. If you light a fire and you build up a head fire and whatever, and say there's a catastrophic fire, the head fire can stop at the edge of town, but what happens is all the smoke and all the embers can go for a mile or two and drop down into palm trees, and everybody's tried to burn palm fronds when they're dead. You know how hot a palm frond, burns, because that goes back to the Carboniferous period. The palm fronds became very adapted to fire back about 350 million years ago. and so those embers hit those palm fronds, and those palm fronds drop sparks down onto your roof or the pine needles, and you got pine needles in your gutter, and you got asphalt shingles, sets your roof on fire and burns your house from the top down. But not only that, it can the embers can actually come in through ventilation systems and burn houses from the inside. And so what you've got is some people have metal roofs, and they have fireproof siding on the sides of the house, and they have defensible space around their house so that the fires from other buildings and stuff can't get can't.
But it comes in through the ventilation. Ed, I got to take a time out. Ed Komarek is here, and we'll continue to discuss wildfires and pyro-terrorism when the Conspiracy Show returns. My name is Richard Serrett. Stay with us.
You're listening to The Conspiracy Show with Richard Serrett from Zoomer Radio.
Hey, if you love rock and roll and you love mysteries, you're going to enjoy my podcast, The Rock and Roll Twilight Zone with Richard Serrett. New episodes drop every Wednesday at midnight, 12 a.m. Eastern. It's part of the Jericho Network, as in Chris Jericho, the wrestler from WWE. Check it out, The Rock and Roll Twilight Zone with Richard Serrett. It's now available on Spotify. You can also access it through my website, strangeplanet.ca. The Rock and Roll Twilight Zone with Richard Serrett. Ed Komarek is with us, and Fire in Nature, A Fire Activist's Guide is one of his books. We're talking about wildfires and how the culture of fire suppression has led to these increasingly intense wildfires that we're seeing around the world. But the big concern now is that there are terrorist groups that will seize upon this and start a truly catastrophic wildfire. And Homeland Security is worried about this. So how would this happen in to your mind? Would they?
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me finish up a little bit about the reason that one house burns and another house next to it doesn't burn. Is like I was talking about. One of the reasons is embers. One house has a tin roof and it's well protected, doesn't have any eucalyptus trees next to it or pines. And needles on the roof to catch the roof on fire or to catch the siding on fire because there's no defensible space. And people can search the internet for just type in Firewise, and they'll explain to you how to protect your house, to fire harden your house from burning embers and wildfires. But as we've moved from in the cities and moved out into the suburbs, out into the wildlands, you have the public fire suppression in our national forests, and whatever, that's causing huge fuel accumulations, and that's added to by the people living in that wildlife interface that have a lot of flammable material all around their houses and everything. And so what happens is a catastrophic wildfire that normally would be burning on the ground, in a light fire, say ponderosa pine forest, and wouldn't be hurting the trees, and it would be, ecosystem friendly and everything else. Instead, because of all the fuel, it goes up into the crown of the tree and causes the whole crown to burst into flames, which creates these huge firestorms or walls of flame. And even if it burns up the people, on the edge of the city in the interface, with the head fire, all these embers start dropping down all over the place to the rest of the city and brought into ventilations and on the roofs that catch on fire and everything else. And so that's why you have this sporadic distribution of burned out houses and whatever. And that's part of it. And part of it is that fire is just fickle. It's always being affected by wind and humidity and whatever. And so the wind blows it one way, very hot, and then it backs in kind of cool the other way. So even in catastrophic forests like lodgepole pine that burn catastrophically, and they have what they call serotinous cones that require fire for them to feed in on a burn and whatever, and those cones can get burned black on the outside, and those seeds are still protected on the inside and drop down. But even in lodgepole pine, you have places where there's very hot and it burns through all the crowns and in catastrophic fire, and other places where it just backs into underneath the lodgepole pine and leaves little green grows and whatever. So is there's a lot of variables that involve fire, and that's the reason that people make the mistake of thinking there's some kind of exotic reason for why these things have happened and whatever. And so now you have arsonists lighting fires, and whatever, into these catastrophic areas and causing a lot of these mega fires. And some of them are actually even firefighters. I just noticed today I got put onto it that 100, on the average, 100 firefighters a year are convicted of arson.
Is that right? 100 firefighters a year? Why on earth?
I think
why on earth?
Look up Wikipedia firefighters arson, and that is a Wikipedia entry I just found there that says 100. That's not all wildland firefighters, but wildland firefighters are part of that and whatever. But that's a whole other thing. So you've got arson that's ready to light the things, but it gets taken to a whole new level in the next several years. Because what happens is the pyro-terrorists get into this, and they realize that we built this powder keg. So why should they have to try to find an atomic, make an atomic bomb or whatever, when you have the power of multiple atomic bombs out there in our forests right up next to our cities? So all they got to do is go upwind and light a line of fire with an airplane or a car along the highway. And that fire within an hour will burn through the urban interface, the urban wildland interface to the edge of the city, and then the sparks will drop onto the rest of the city and create firestorms like you had in Dresden and Tokyo. And the fires that we have now, the arson fires we have now, are not too bad because people can evacuate. But if somebody lit a line of fire north of the city or whatever, within an hour, that city could be incinerated, and people couldn't get out because all the roads would be blocked of people trying to get out and whatever. And it used to be like there was in the central United States, it was a really bad fire way back in the 1800s, and people all had to run down in the river. Well, you can't do that anymore. You got too far to run. If you can't get out with your car, you're stuck.
Right.
And so people, you hadn't seen nothing yet. And California is right in the terrorist sites because the terrorists have been watching what's been going on in California. First, they started talking about Montana, using fire as a weapon in Montana, but now it's shifted. You can see from the material that I posted here just recently on an article I did on Homeland Security and Pyro-terrorism. It's under the More button on my Fire and Nature book, and anybody can read for free. But there's also articles there under the more button that I've written on fire history and pyro-terrorism and a billion-acre plan to really get our forests and grasslands back in shape to end this wildfire problem. But it's going to take billions and billions, maybe $100 billion or more, and nobody wants to come up with that kind of money to prescribe fire the good big chunk.
So
of
Homeland Security is saying it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when some terrorist cell, some lone wolf, decides to light the fuse on this huge powder keg, which could be absolutely catastrophic. As you say, it would be like the firebombing in Dresden.
Like the terrorists spent years training on how to fly airplanes into buildings before they did 9/11. Well, we've got thousands, maybe tens of thousands of firefighters, out there with connections to the Middle East. And people traveling back and forth to California, back into the Middle East, and one of the articles that I linked onto my pyro-terrorism article, talks about that they're debating, whether it's a good thing to, it's right to burn forests in order to kill people and stuff and whatever.
All right, Ed, I got to take another time out. We'll come back. The Conspiracy Show. My name is Richard Serra. Don't go away. Hey, can't get enough of conspiracy and paranormal talk? Well, you don't have to wait an entire week to listen to me on the radio. I have a podcast called Conspiracy Unlimited, and it drops 3 days a week. Brand new episodes every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Conspiracy Unlimited. You can check it out and listen and subscribe at conspiracyunlimitedpodcast.com. conspiracyunlimitedpodcast.com. But it's available everywhere you get your favorite podcasts. You can also access it through my website, strangeplanet.ca. Conspiracy Unlimited. Don't miss it.
When in doubt, blame the government. You're listening to The Conspiracy Show with Richard Serrett from Zoomer Radio.
Ed Komarek is here. We're talking about wildfires and pyro-terrorism. Let me just read this. This was a keynote address at the Firehouse World Conference in San Diego back in February 2013. The speaker was Robert Baird, the U.S. Forest Service's Deputy Director of Fire and Aviation Management. And this is what he said. The United States is at grave risk of future pyro-terrorist attack when terrorists unleash the latent energy in the nation's forests to achieve the effect of a weapon of mass destruction. We must define the threat, understand America's vulnerabilities, and take action to mitigate this danger to our homeland. Now, let's just talk for a few minutes, Ed, about how fire has been used as a tool of warfare. People might remember, the Second World War, and the Japanese sent these fire balloons over to cause wildfires, and this was an attack on the U.S. mainland by the Japanese that maybe some people aren't aware of, but these fire balloons, they killed about 6 people in Oregon. How else has fire been used as a weapon?
Native peoples and even Europeans used it to shoot fire arrows into thatch roofed houses and buildings in towns. Another way is on ships. They used to shoot fire arrows onto ships to catch the ships on fire.
Right.
So there's a long history of the use of fire as a weapon.
And I believe the Aboriginal peoples of Australia sort of used fire to discourage the British settlers coming onto their island.
I don't know about that. I'd have to search it on the internet. But the native peoples fought amongst themselves. Used fire arrows to catch their other tribes' buildings on fire.
Right.
And it goes on, back in history. Pitch bombs. You get a bomb of burning pitch, and you throw it and you heave it over onto the ship, and it spreads out, across the ship and catches the ship on fire. So fire's been a weapon, for as long as man has fought, with other people.
Here's ABC News. There was an issue of Inspire magazine, which surfaced on jihadi forums. Again, this is ABC News reporting this. An issue of Inspire magazine, which surfaced on jihadi forums with one article titled, "It is of your freedom to ignite a firebomb." And it gave detailed instructions on how to build an Ember bomb in a forest in the United States. So there's already chatter out there among certain terrorist groups that this is what they want.
They're already doing it. They're putting Ember bombs up on kites this last summer, on kites and balloons, and that blow into Israel, and has set a lot of fires. And all through Israel, there's like 100 and something fires, all got started at once or something, and quite a few Palestinians were caught and prosecuted on that. So it's nothing new. So it's just a matter of an there's nothing to an Ember bomb. All you got to have is a bucket full of charcoal, burning charcoal, and the tongs, and you can just flip it out, or sparklers, or anything. But most people aren't going to understand it. But firefighters certainly do, and so that really worries me a lot, because firefighters have the skills, and there's tens of thousands of firefighters that have been trained, to fight fires, that have the skills. And it's really not, if you have the skills, it's not really that complicated to create a situation like you had in World War II with Dresden and Tokyo, and some of that bombing was deliberately, in World War II was deliberately to create firestorms, and some of it just happened because they bombed so much. But some of it was, they used flammable, bombs and stuff, whatever. I think on Tokyo, because Tokyo was a lot of wooden and paper shanties and whatever all through Tokyo, and so there were a large numbers of people that were killed in Tokyo as well as in Dresden, and so it's all through our history. As long as as man has been man, fighting and involved in warfare. But there are solutions to this problem. People, once people realize that they're sitting ducks in some of these cities and towns out in the western United States, they can do things. One of the things they can do is they fire harden their own houses, and they go on the internet and they study up a little bit about how to fire harden your house and to create defensible space for your house. But you can also create prescribed fire buffers around the city, particularly where the prevailing winds come from. So that if there was a pyro-terrorist attack, it would hit that prescribed fire zone several miles wide and fizzle out, and so it couldn't get to the city. But that's going to take a lot of money, because here I burn per acre for my clients it's only about $12 an acre. But you burn in the western United States, it's $500 to $2,500 per acre. So, and you've got millions of acres that need to be treated with prescribed fire. And the more you get into the wildland urban interface, the more expensive it gets, because you got to watch out so you don't burn up people's houses and whatever when you're using prescribed fire and whatever. But it's got to be done. It's either spend $100 billion now or end up with $1 trillion of damages in burned out cities and loss of life and everything later on. So
how vulnerable is Los Angeles, Ed, to such an attack of pyro-terror, where the whole city could be incinerated?
Well, you have to look. You have to get on the internet and study that. I know some places when I was over there, like where Redding got burned out. Was it like 1,000 buildings or whatever in Redding this summer got burned out? There's places in California when those winds come in and something ignites it, whether it's power poles or arsonists or whatever, the catastrophic fires are unstoppable. And I remember like Santa Barbara back in the 70s, I went on a sailboat, and those people have built their houses amongst all this brush all the way up the sides of the hillsides and mountains. And so they're extremely vulnerable, to it. And so Los Angeles, and I've been through the area around outside of Los Angeles, you got a lot of brush and a lot of fuel and grasses and whatever. And I had some friends that lived north of Los Angeles, and they had a ranch up on the top of a hill, and that was very vulnerable because the fire could just be lit down on the bottom of the hill and just run right up the side of the hill or whatever. So if you've got brush and grasses and even combustible fires, you've got ponderosa pine that hasn't been burned for 30 or 40 years, or you've got lodgepole pine, which is a catastrophic fire type, which burns everything in its path, just like eucalyptus does or whatever. You're really setting yourself up for big trouble at some point or whatever.
But is it conceivable that the entire city could go up?
I'd have to see some studies on that, and people don't like to talk about it. They don't even like to talk about this subject, but it's got to be done, because you can just see what's happening is the fires are getting hotter and hotter, and there's more and more ignitions from people and arsonists and whatever, and we can see when it goes on into pyro-terrorism that we hadn't seen nothing yet, and it's going to make 9/11 be like child's play if one or more cities go up in a line of catastrophic fire where people can't get out in time. And so there's some are more vulnerable than others. Now Perth, Australia is a leader. They're building prescribed fire zones all around Perth, and even within the city limits of Perth, I think, or whatever. And in Arizona, in Flagstaff, Arizona, they've got building prescribed fire buffers all around Flagstaff. So Flagstaff is getting pretty well protected, but a lot of these cities are wide open. And I just don't know about Los Angeles, but it could be vulnerable. And anywhere where you've got a lot of dead grass and brush and trees that haven't been burned for a long time, even chaparral chaparral is a catastrophic fire type. It burns, maybe every, 30, 40 years. Have to look at it, more up on the internet or whatever. But when it burns everything in its path. And if you're building amongst chaparral, you're really asking for it. But all this has got to do with just public ignorance of nature and fire being part of nature and how to manage fire properly. We've got to go back to what the native fire managers were doing and rebuild these ecosystems, these light fire ecosystems, back to what they were, the old growth forests. These old growth forests didn't happen. Nature, developed these old growth forests to a certain degree, but a lot of it was actually managed and created by the native fire managers who burned more and more frequently. So you had cooler and cooler fires. The more often you burn, the cooler your fires are going to be. The less often you burn, the hotter the fire is going to be in general. Now you get up into, you've got light fire ecosystems, in the eastern United States and western United States, and up in Canada, up around Toronto. I don't know what kind of trees you have up there, whatever, but when you get up in further north in the arboreal forests and whatever, you get into catastrophic fire types of trees. But what you have there is a fire mosaic, is that catastrophic fires will burn out one area and then another area, and they overlap, and the moose and the game and the elk can move from one successionary stage to another depending on what their food source is. A fire will burn and stuff will sprout up. They'll be able to eat it. It'll get too high for them to eat, so they need to go to another catastrophic burn. But what happens is you suppress all these, even these catastrophic fires. You destroy them up the fire mosaic. That's what they did in Yellowstone. Is that 80% of Yellowstone is lodgepole pine, which is a catastrophic fire type that burns, through the tops of the trees and whatever. And they just burned all of Yellowstone at one time, and so they wiped out the fire mosaic. But now they're letting fires burn back in Yellowstone finally again and whatever, and recreating that fire mosaic. So fire is probably a factor in the evolution of probably 80% of the forest. Probably not the tropics, but most everywhere else, temperate zones, even all the way up into the Arctic.
Pyro-terrorism, the threat of arson-induced forest fires as a future terrorist weapon of mass destruction. And Ed Komarek is sounding the alarms. So is Homeland Security, although we're not hearing too much about this as a potential threat. We'll take a time out, and at a certain point, maybe in the second hour, we can switch gears because you've got other things that we can talk about as well. But we'll also open up the phones and take questions and comments. Toll free from out of town, 1-866-740-4740. 1-866-740-4740. And in the greater Toronto area, 416-360-0740. 416-360-0740. Now, in terms of hardening your home or hardening an entire city, you mentioned these buffers. So, just in the minute or so that remains, let's talk a little bit about that. How do you protect a city?
Okay. Once you get these buffers in place and whatever, and you protect the wildland urban interface and the city itself, then you can move out back into the national forest and whatever, and you don't have to worry about burning up people's houses. So you can prescribe fire, for ponderosa pine, for giant. We almost lost our giant sequoias here, I think several years ago, whatever, by catastrophic fire, because there's only not that many sequoias, and they go back to the Cretaceous. And the only groves that I know about are the ones in California and the ones in China. And how did those sequoias get way over into China? It's because back when the sequoias and the pines and everything, developed, it was when the continents were all together and the continents all separated. And so you have pines all over the world that all came from original source, the same way with the sequoias, which are more of a remnant population. There's not that many left.
Ed, we've got a break here, top of the hour. We'll come back. Phone lines are open, and we'll continue to touch on pyro-terrorism and fire suppression culture for a few moments yet, and then maybe we'll switch gears. Ed has lots to talk about. Back with more of The Conspiracy Show. Stay with us.
You're listening to The Conspiracy Show with Richard Serrett from Zoomer Radio.